Krishna, everyone. Welcome back for yet another session on our lectures on the glories of Sri Vrindavan Dham. Happy to be with you. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Pashtaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharane Nivishesha Shunyavadi Paschita Deshatarane. Well, I have to admit I've been looking forward to this particular discussion today. Recently we were discussing the glories of Srila Sanatana Goswami's deity Madan Mohan. And while we were doing so, we mentioned, of course, three Vrindavan deities in particular, who are very dear to the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, as stated by Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami and Chaitanya Charitamrita, Adi Leela 119. E tina takura godi yake, yadi yachena atmasat, e tinera charana bandhon, tine mora nata. These three deities of Vrindavan, Madan Mohan, Govinda, and Gopinath, have absorbed the heart and souls of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas. I worship their lotus feet, for they are the lords of my heart. Kaviraj Goswami. So I think that a natural progression would be to begin discussing the glories of Srila Rupa Goswami's deity, Govindadev. In Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, we hear a very, very beautiful description of Govindaji, a description that's very dear to the hearts of Gaudiya Vaishnavas. And it's as follows. Quote, in a forest of desire trees, known as Vrindavan, is a golden mansion, and in its midst is a jeweled throne at the place called Yogapith. Seated thereupon is Sri Govindadev, a veritable Cupid incarnate. He is served there as a king, bedecked with divine clothes, ornaments, and other paraphernalia, served incessantly by thousands and thousands of devotees, unquote. We mentioned the other day how we approached Madan Mohan to reestablish our lost relationship with Krishna. That's called Shambandha. Then we cultivate and we nurture that relationship with Govindaji. That's called Abhideya. Then finally we approach Gopinath to serve him in a spontaneous, loving mood, like the gopis of Vrindavan. That's called Pariyojana. So as we've heard in previous lectures, Govindaji was ordered and carved 5,000 years ago by Brajranabha, the great-grandson of Krishna, under the supervision of Uttara, the mother of Maharaj Parikshit, because she'd actually seen the Lord, so she could give some direction there. But to make a long story short, because we have a lot of material to cover today, Govindaji, as he's affectionately known by his devotees, was lost with the progress of time. And it was our beloved Srila Rupa Goswami who eventually discovered Govindaji again 500 years ago. And as we know, one of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's instructions to the six Goswamis of Vrindavan was to establish deities and temples in Vrindavan. And it's interesting, actually, how these deities appeared in different ways to our six Goswamis. Recently we heard how Madan Mohan appeared to Sanatana Goswami, and we all know how Radharaman appeared to our beloved Gopal Bhatta Goswami from Ashalagram Shila. But Govindaji's appearance to Srila Rupa Goswami is no less amazing, because a number of the Goswamis had already found and discovered their deities before him, so he was really anxious to find his deity. And in his heart, it's described, he knew who was his Ishtadeva, of course, his worshipable deity, Govindaji. So we hear accounts how he was spending a lot of time wandering around Vrindavan, asking the villagers, actually, have you seen my Govindaji? Have you seen my Govindaji? Have you seen the Lord of my heart? Prabhupada said this is very much the mood of Vrindavan, that we're searching for Krishna, we're looking for Krishna, we're hankering for Krishna. But no one, of course, had seen Govindaji. So one day, you could say like in desperation, Sri Rupa Goswami went to the bank of the Jamuna River and he sat down and just started crying. Crying and crying, these are real tears. Upset that he had not found the Lord of his heart. So suddenly a little boy, a cowherd boy, you can guess, he came along and he said, Baba, why are you crying? Are you hungry? No one in my village goes hungry. So Sri Rupa Goswami looked up and he said to the little boy, your village? This is your village? So the boy said with confidence, yes, this is my village. Then that boy, he sat down next to Rupa Goswami and he said, Baba, why is it that you look so sad? So somehow or other, Sri Rupa Goswami was inspired to reveal his mind to this cowherd boy. So he said to the cowherd boy, well, you know, all the other Goswamis have fulfilled the instruction of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to find deities of Krishna and establish temples. But I haven't found my Govindaji yet. So the little boy smiled and he said, oh, Baba, I know where he is. I sport all over the fields of Vrindavan. I go here, I go there, I go everywhere. And I often notice when I come down here to this particular part of the Jamuna every day, I see that a Sarabi cow comes at the same time every day to that little rise on the hill over there. There's a little hill there, not far from the Jamuna. She climbs up on that little hill and she stops and she pours out her milk, pours milk out from her udders with so much affection on a certain spot. Why don't you go there and look? So Srila Rupa Goswami took that as a divine message, divine indication, and he quickly went up the hill and he looked at that particular place where the Sarabi cow would stop and her milk would pour out. And sure enough, there was a little hole there. And he looked very closely, and lo and behold, what did he see? He saw Govindaji's top knot. If you see a photo of Govindaji before he has all his decor and his clothes, he has a little top knot. His hair is tied like that, top knot, on his head. So that was sticking out. So at that moment, Sri Rupa Goswami understood that that young boy who had directed him to that spot was none other than Krishna himself. And so in great happiness, of course he was ecstatic, he called out to some nearby cowherd men, some villagers, oh, I found Govindaji. Come help me, take him from the ground. So the villagers came and very carefully with, their tools, they extracted the deity, and he's a big deity, Govindaji. Took him out of the earth. And that spot is very famous. That's called Govindashtali, Shri Govindashtali. So after finding Govindaji, Rupa Goswami's, how could I put it, his bliss knew no bounds. And what he did, it's really interesting. He wrote a letter to Lord Chaitanya. Imagine writing a letter to Lord Chaitanya and having him receive it. So he wrote this letter to Mahaprabhu, and he said something of the sort that, my dear Mahaprabhu, I have fulfilled your order. I have found Govindaji, and I'm establishing his worship. But please, could you send someone or some ones to help me? Because, well, I'm alone, and I want to establish the best worship of the Lord according to your desires. So Mahaprabhu, he received this letter. He was in Jagannath Puri, and he was very happy to receive this news. And therefore he requested one of his most intimate followers. His name was Kashishwara. Kashishwara. Mahaprabhu had two very close servants, Govinda and Kashishwara. So he said to Kashishwara, I want you to go to Vrindavan and help Sri Rupa Goswami in his service to Govindaji. So of course, who wouldn't want to do such a service? But we must understand at the same time that Kashishwara was already the servant of the Lord. He was the servant of the incarnation of Krishna for this age, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And he was very attached to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. But the order of the Lord, or the order of the spiritual master, the devotee takes up with all heart and soul. Because the pleasure of Krishna, the pleasure of the spiritual master, that's actually our pleasure when they're satisfied. But Kashishwara, he expressed some disappointment in having to leave Mahaprabhu's seva. So Mahaprabhu took compassion on him, and he presented him with the deity who at that time he was personally worshipping. The deity is called Gaur Govinda. You can jump ahead a little bit here. If you want to see Gaur Govinda, you can go to Jaipur, where Govinda Devi is now, Radha Govinda, and on the side, just of, just next to the feet actually of Govindaji, there's this beautiful deity of Gaur Govinda, which Mahaprabhu gave as a concession to Kashishwara. So now you go. I've given you Krishna. So Kashishwara arrived, and the puja was going on. It was going on in a hut, because that's all that Rupa Goswami had. He was a renunciate. However, in the year I think it was 1590, the famous emperor Akbar. We spoke about Akbar. I won't have to introduce him again too much. We spoke about Akbar in our previous lectures. He helped to build a temple for Govindaji, along with a grant of, I think it was 135 acres of land for growing vegetables, fruits, and flowers for the deity. Now, as we mentioned, we'll go a little bit here. Akbar was Muslim, actually Mughal, but very broad-minded, and he, as I mentioned earlier, he appreciated and even studied other religions, including Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And one interesting fact that I discovered in my research is that one of his generals, and actually a very close friend of his, was a prominent Vaishnav Kshatriya, a Kshatriya. His name was Rajman Singh. He came from Rajasthan. We'll hear a little bit later how many of the kings of Rajasthan, which is, of course, south of Vrindavan, some distance, some 300 kilometers, these kings at that time of history, they were mostly Krishna Bhaktas, as were the members of their family. So this one of his generals in Akbar's army, one of his generals was Rajman Singh. Now, to explain how that happened, how a Vaishnav serving in the army of the Mughals. But in those days, a number of Vaishnava rulers, Rajput kings and their families, they entered into alliances and treaties with the Mughals. It was a form of diplomacy, because the Mughals were very, very powerful. So rather, if you can't beat them, join them, kind of thing. That's a crude way of saying it, but out of diplomacy, so they didn't lose everything, they agreed to cooperate. And as a result, these Rajput kings and their families, they were more or less left free to rule their kingdoms in Rajasthan, although they had to pay heavy taxes to the emperor. And they were also obliged to fight along with the emperor's forces. Yeah. They were to fight, join the army and fight whoever was the enemy or of the emperor, or to put down rebellions and so forth. So it's not a perfect deal, but their kingdoms continued to flourish, so to say, the Rajput kings. So it's written that Raj Man Singh was one of the first Rajasthani princes. He was a prince at that time, to acknowledge the Mughal authority, diplomacy. He was also very intimately connected to Emperor Akbar by the fact that he married Akbar's sister. It would go that far, there would be marriages like this. And I read, because for me it's really interesting, I read that Rajman Singh actually lived in the Mughal court of Akbar. And he was actually Emperor Akbar's close companion from the age of 12. It appeared he had to move up from Rajasthan to Delhi at a young age, part of the diplomacy. But they became good friends. And the relationship of this prince at the time and the king was more than just official, because I found paintings of young Akbar and young Rajman Singh engaged in playful wrestling after a night of drinking. That's what it says on the painting. They were buddies. Interesting. So different but similar in many ways. Actually, both of them, they had the Lord dear to their heart. So, like many Rajasthani members of royal families, Rajman Singh was a true Vaishnava. And when he wasn't busy fighting wars, because he became a general, he was a very expert warrior. So when he wasn't busy, fighting wars on behalf of Emperor Akbar, he would spend time in Vrindavan. Of course, home in Rajasthan, but he spent a lot of time in Vrindavan. And one time, Emperor Akbar was considering giving a large piece of land to his friend and his general, Rajman Singh. Sometimes the emperors would give gifts like this for Rajman Singh and his family. But there's always politics and government, so other generals were objecting. So it didn't manifest. But Rajman Singh, he wanted this for his family, for posterity, etc. So on one visit to Braj, it's so sweet, Rajman Singh, he went to see Govindaji, being worshipped in a very simple way. And he prayed as follows: Lord, if you can make sure that I get a tract of land, I will raise enough money to build you the most beautiful temple this world has ever seen here in Sri Vrindavan Dham. So it just so happened he was back in Delhi on business with the emperor, and the emperor, his friend, called him one day to come into his quarters, and he said he didn't know about this, that he'd requested the deity in this way. So, but he said, Man Singh, you've been fighting on my behalf so nicely. You've subdued my enemies and conquered for me. So I have decided, I've decided to grant you that large tract of land, despite what the other generals say. You have it. So then, at that point, immediately remembering his promise to the Lord, Rajman Singh, he said to Akbar, I would like to build a temple for my Lord in Vrindavan. And Akbar immediately gave his blessings. Remember the other day we said that to do anything in Vrindavan, to construct, you had to have permission of the emperor. So he gave. It's just amazing how our history has unfolded. So that without going into too much detail, this magnificent temple, which even today architects go and study because it's just an amazing piece of architecture. The temple of Govinda Dev was built. It took many years, of course, but I came across a famous scholar from some time ago, but he wrote, quote, "The temple of Govinda Dev was built at a time that saw both the consolidation of Mughal power and the revival of Bhakti Vaishnavism. At the same time, the Mughals were coming into power. At the same time, there was a revival of Bhakti Vaishnavism. And what is that? That's the movement of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And that's interesting. He continues, he said, it could possibly, this temple of Govinda Dev could possibly be called a Mughal temple, for it had the patronage of the highest Mughal nobility, and the use of red sandstone, which was usually just meant for big mosques, actually, and the use of red sandstone in its construction, which was in itself a hallmark of the imperial style. However, it is clearly designed, he wrote, to serve the purposes of the leaders of a new form of popular faith in North India, that of Gaudiya Vaishnavism." Wow. History in the making. Of course, we're also, by Prabhupada's grace, this particular moment in the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Prabhupada said one time, one day scholars will write how this Hare Krishna movement saved the world in its darkest hour. He told that to Guru Das in London in the early 70s. Someday scholars will write how this Hare Krishna movement saved the world in its darkest hours. I firmly believe that. So, some years after construction, there's a gorgeous temple there for Govindaji. But something very important, I think a better word is something essential, was missing. And what could that be? Vrindavaneshwari Srimati Radharani. She wasn't there. Of course, she's always there in the sense that she's Anapayini. Anapayini means that Radha, Sri Radha, is never separated from Krishna. Maybe he's some distance away, but in her heart she's always with Krishna. So she wasn't there. So we heard last week how the son of Maharaj Pataparudra in Puri, his name was Purushottam Jana. You remember, he sent two deities of Radharani to Vrindavan because he wanted to assist in this way, give these deities their consorts. And one was for Madan Mohan and one was for Govindaji. But you remember, as it turned out, one was actually Radha and one was Lalita, according to the dream of the Pujari at Madan Mohan temple. So Madan Mohan got them both. So when Maharaj Pataparudra, the actual king of Jagannath Puri, he heard this, he became concerned. So that night he had a dream. And in his dream, Radharani appeared to him. And she said, "Sir, I'm actually present in the Jagannath temple, but for 1,000 years, everyone has worshipped me as Lakshmi. For 1,000 years, everyone has worshipped me as Lakshmi. They think I'm Lakshmi, but I'm not Lakshmi. I'm actually Radha. So when you wake up in the morning, go to the temple, the big Jagannath temple, Jagannath Puri temple. Take me from the temple and send me to Govindaji in Vrindavan." Wow, what a service. You imagine Srimati Radharani giving you that service? Oh, here in the material world, such an intimate service. Something like that can qualify you to go back to Godhead. So when he woke up in the morning, the king, he went to the temple and he told all the pandits. He found that deity of Lakshmi and he said to them, "This deity here, she's not Lakshmi, she's Radha. And they went, oh. But then he shared his dream. And also he was the king. So you don't argue with the king. And they agreed. And he had that deity of Radharani moved from the temple, and very carefully with a number of guards and soldiers. Can you imagine sending a deity at that time in history from Orissa to Vrindavan, through the jungle, and there's so many thieves and dacoits, and what an adventure. This is adventure. And she was installed next to her beloved Govindaji. So in this way, Govindaji, he got his Radha, and Radha got Govindaji. Sri Radha Govinda Deva ki. Sri Rupa Goswami ki. So, with the patronage of the Mughal emperors, because more were to come, and the relative peaceful coexistence of Hindus and Muslims at that time, the worship went on very smoothly for many years. However, again, unfortunately, we touched on this point recently, in the mid-1600s, I don't know the date, 1650, 1660, a new emperor ascended the throne. And again, I don't want to say his name, but Aurangzeb. And he had a very long reign of 50 years, and he proved to be the most evil tyrant in India's history. And immediately upon assuming power, he issued a decree that all the old Hindu temples could no longer be renovated. We mentioned this past time in the last lecture, but we'll go a little more into detail here. When he first came to power, he just started off slowly. He said, okay, all these old Hindu temples that you're renovating, it's finished. And historians say that he wanted to introduce even more draconian laws. But he was unable to do so for two reasons. And that was, he had two of his chief generals, whom he very much depended on, like he did, like previously we heard Akbar depended upon Man Singh. Aurangzeb had two chief generals who were Vaishnavas. Same policies are going on, this diplomacy. And those generals were actually kings in Rajasthan. First one was Raja Jai Singh I of Amber, and the second was the king of Rajpur, Raja Yashovanti. Raja Yashovanti. And they were good fighters, and they did their jobs. And Aurangzeb knew that if he was tougher on the Hindus, or we're speaking specifically about Vaishnavas, Raja Jai Singh I and Raj Yashovanti, who were actually good friends, they would rise up against him. And they were powerful generals. And they had armies of their own. Unfortunately, some years later, Jai Singh I, he died under, I read, mysterious circumstances. Most historians agree that Aurangzeb had him secretly poisoned because he wanted to get on with his nefarious activities. He was very inimical to the Vaishnavas in particular. So after Jai Singh I was poisoned, at that point, that's the point that his son ascended to the throne, Jai Singh II, who we mentioned in a previous lecture. He ascended the throne. He became ruler of Amber, but he was only 12 years old. But eventually, as he grew up, Jai Singh II also served in the Mughal army. But later he broke free and became an independent ruler of his own in that kingdom of Amber. And Aurangzeb couldn't do anything about it because, Jai Singh II was an expert ruler, good manager, and he very intelligently over the years built up a big armory of weapons and soldiers, and he made alliances with other Rajput kings. So it's kind of history was unfolding. So it was difficult for Aurangzeb to do anything. And when he broke away, I read that to give him strength and to protect his people against the Mughals, when he broke away, what he did is he immediately performed an Aswamedha sacrifice. Now we hear about Aswamedha sacrifices. That's the biggest yajna you can do. But such a sacrifice had not been done for thousands of years. And I'll jump ahead a little bit. Later, when he established his city of Jaipur, he had two more Aswamedha yajnas, one in 1727 and one, when he established the city of Jaipur, he established the city of Jaipur in 1727, and he performed two more Aswamedha sacrifices, one in 1734 and one in 1741. These are huge, costly endeavors involving so much paraphernalia, so much effort and time and brahmanas, and Aswamedha is just a major, major endeavor. But Yajna by Vishnu. Yajnas are meant to please Krishna. And Krishna reciprocates, especially for warriors. Rakhe Krishna Mari Ke, Mari Krishna Rakhe Ke. Krishna wants to kill you, no one can save you. Krishna wants to save you, no one can kill you. So he's an intelligent ruler. But after, going back to our story, after Jai Singh the first, his father was poisoned, and of course Jai Singh the second was just a boy, Aurangzeb started increasing his harassment of the Hindus and the Vaishnavas. Because Jai Singh the first is gone, so he got right back into it. And what he did is he immediately closed all Hindu schools. Hindu meaning all the different spiritual traditions that we find in Hinduism, yoga, jnana yoga, bhakti yoga, raja yoga, and the followers of Lord Shiva and those who worship demigods. No more schooling for any of those people. And then he got really heavy. And he ordered that the Hindu religion should be suppressed with a heavy hand and the sword. So we're going into this dark history here. But it got worse. Because soon he began sending his soldiers out. This is a little difficult to say, but they went out and they were ordered to collect the right thumbs of as many brahmanas as they could. Because he knew that they chanted their mantras, they chanted the Gayatri with the right thumb. So what a demon he was. And unfortunately, it's just to set the scene for you to understand. It's described that those soldiers would come back every day with large barrels of thumbs. Many, many barrels of thumbs. Hare Krishna. So the situation was getting very desperate. Unfortunately, by that time, Raj Yashovanti, remember the good friend of Jai Singh I, powerful general, he'd grown very old. He'd actually, you could say, retired from fighting. He was in his kingdom. And he saw this going on. He was remembering when, he was young and Jai Singh I was young, and they were so powerful that they held Aurangzeb at bay. So now he's a Vaishnava. He's seeing all these atrocities go on. You can imagine how frustrating. He's an old man. He can't do anything. So he wrote something famously. He wrote something very famous. He wrote, quote, "The bells no longer ring in the temples. The emperor fears no one. Oh, my Jai Singh I, please return once again." That brings tears to your eyes. The bells no longer ring in the temples. The emperor fears no one. Oh, Jai Singh, his friend, right? Oh, Jai Singh, please return once again. Wow. Now, all this madness culminated one day when Aurangzeb was sitting in his palace in Agra. That's where it was one of the main places he would stay, was Agra. And he was looking out the window of his palace when he noticed a light, which was actually a fire burning, controlled fire burning, on top of Govindaji's temple in Vrindavan. Now you know there's some distance between Vrindavan and Agra. It takes about 45 minutes to drive to Agra from Vrindavan. So he's some distance away. But he could see this light on top of Govindaji's temple. And he looked very closely and he realized that Govindaji's temple was bigger than his palace. So what did he do? At that very moment, he issued a decree that all temples in Vrindavan and all their deities should be destroyed. So this was late at night. And while his soldiers were preparing to go to Vrindavan the next morning, one of Aurangzeb's servants, God bless him, who had become sympathetic to the Vaishnavas, slipped away and came to Vrindavan during the night and went temple to temple, informing the pujaris that Aurangzeb's soldiers were coming at sunrise to destroy everything. God bless his soul. And by sunrise, all the principal deities in Vrindavan had been whisked away or hidden in certain kunds or gardens or forests or whatever. That's the history. Now, various deities were hidden in different places. And they were hidden very well. I guess the Vaishnavas had they were planning that maybe something like this was going to happen. Some strategic planning was there. So immediately they were all hidden. Of course, it was during Mughal rule, so there were probably other times they had to hide the deities as well. You can imagine living in that time. Because these deities are the life and soul. Prandanahe. They're the life and soul of the worshipper. Prandanahe. But the three principal deities that we've mentioned many times, Madan Mohan, Govindaji and Gopinath, they were taken out to Radhakund for safekeeping, along with their consort, Srimati Radharani. Now you may think, why are they all taken to Radhakund? It's only a 45-minute drive. Even less nowadays. You can get there in 30 minutes, I think, from Vrindavan on a quiet day. But in those days, it was something much different. It was mostly jungle the whole way. And along the way lived the Jats, G-A-T-S, Jats. The Jats were village people, they were farmers, but they were tough. They were tough. And they were not afraid to fight the Mughals. They weren't Kshatriyas, but they were Kshatriyas in their own right. They were not afraid. Actually, this is one characteristic of a Kshatriya, that he has no fear. Because even if he dies on the battlefield, he knows he's going to Swargaloka. So these Jats, they would fight with the Mughals. They would often lose, but because they were fearless, the Mughals, didn't want to fight with them. So this was the strategy at that time. The Vaishnavas figured it out. So they took Madan Mohan, Govindaji, and Gopinath out to Radhakund. And they were worshipped in secret for a number of years, actually. But after some time, you know how things are, word started getting out, and the deities are there. So the devotees, they decided to move them further out in Vrindavan, actually to the border of Rajasthan, to the sacred forest, or the city, you could say, also, of Kamyavan. We had a lecture on Kamyavan recently. So there again, they were worshipped in secret for some years. Now, most significantly, eventually news reached the devotees, the pujaris in Kamyavan, that I can say our beloved Raj Jai Singh II, I've seen his weapons actually. There's a museum in Jaipur. It's the Palace Museum, I forget exactly how they call it. But there they have a wide assortment of the weapons that were used in these warfares at that time. It's all very interesting. The armor they wore, and you can see some of Jai Singh's personal weapons. Yes, he had some good weapons. And they even had guns by that time. Primitive form of guns, rifles. But so now the news reached Kamyavan that Jai Singh II, who had now grown up, had offered to shelter the deities in his kingdom at Amber. So one day, all these deities were loaded separately in bullock carts with their consort, Radharani. They were loaded into separate bullock carts, and along with Vrinda Devi. Vrinda Devi had also been moved out there for safekeeping at Kamyavan, and Vrinda Devi is another one of the personal deities of Srila Rupa Goswami that he also discovered. She had been lost for thousands of years as well. So she's very dear to the Gaudiya Vaishnavas for many reasons, and that reason also because was personally worshipped by Rupa Goswami. And we know how important Vrinda Devi is to all of us. So these deities were there, and they were covered with hay, straw and hay. And they took different routes. They left at different times, and they took different routes. To go to Rajasthan, to the Amber Fort, which is 265 kilometers away, not that far. So they all proceeded, except Vrinda Devi. Now we mentioned this many months ago. We were referring somehow we touched on this subject. And we know that Vrinda Devi, when they put her in the cart, she's a big deity, put her in the cart and they took her to the frontier, meaning, you're leaving Vrindavan and going into Rajasthan. Just at the border there, her cart stopped. And nothing and no one, to just put it a very simple way, could make it go further. All the men tried to pull the cart, and they got horses, and then they got bullocks, and maybe they even got an elephant, I don't know. But she would not move. Vrinda Devi stayed in Vrindavan. And her thoughts at that time were especially sweet and full of Braj Bhakti. And how do we know what she was thinking? Through the grace of Sri Baladev Vidyabhushana. He wrote what Vrinda Devi was thinking, why she wouldn't leave Vrindavan. And I quote, "I cannot leave Braj. If I were to leave, then what would the devotees think? If I, Vrinda Devi, were to leave Braj, how could the devotees have faith in Vrindavan if I were not present here?" So true. Then she said famously, "Krishna may come, Krishna may go, but I take a solemn promise, I shall never leave Braj." Wow, makes your hair stand on end. Krishna may come, Krishna may go, but I take a solemn promise, I shall never leave Braj. So she stayed. So for safety reasons, again, these three carts, Madan Mohan, Govindaji, and Gopinath, they took different routes. But today we'll just follow the route of Radha Govinda. So there's a main road, actually, from Vrindavan down to Jaipur. Jaipur wasn't existing then, but there was that kingdom of Amber was there. The Amber Fort was there. So there was a road going from, I remember it goes through Bharatpur. If you know anything, probably you don't know, but Vrindavan, then there's a little off to the left and south, there's Bharatpur. And then from Bharatpur, you go down to Amber and to Jaipur. So that road, it's a highway now. But they used to call that road the King's Road. Or even before that, they called it the Ancient Mobile Road. So previously only kings would travel on that road. But times changed and common people were utilizing that highway. So our bullock cart with our beloved Radha Govinda and that fortunate bullock cart driver, they were moving very slowly along the road with the deities so as not to attract any attention. And by this time, Aurangzeb had died, I read. But you could say in his memory, the Mughals were still searching for these Vrindavan deities, still searching. So they were moving so slow that months and years went by. Years, because they were so careful not to get detected. Very often, the bullock cart would come to a village, and the bullock driver, who was obviously a very qualified devotee, probably just posing as a bullock driver, he would meet secretly with a Brahminical family in any village that they came into, and he would encourage that family to host the deities and worship them in secret. And you can imagine the level of secrecy that was required, especially in a village. You know, in a village, there's village talk, Gramikata. But these were not ordinary villages. These were assemblies of Vaishnavas, families of Vaishnavas, and elders of Vaishnavas, and puja was going on. These were Vaishnav towns. And all the devotees obviously would be informed in the town that Radha Govinda were there. And people knew the long history of Radha Govinda. It had been many years since they had to leave Vrindavan, but people, this was history. Just like, you know, you study American history, English history, French history, Australian. You know the history of your country, for better or worse. So people were aware. And they knew the danger that Radha Govinda were facing. So amongst themselves, they kept the sacred secrets. They kept the sacred secret. And that says a lot. In my country, in America, we had a famous politician. His name was Benjamin Franklin. And he once said, 3 can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. 3 can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. So we must respect those Vaishnavas at that time, how they kept a tight lip. Mum's the word, they say in England, mum's the word. So again, it took a number of years like this to go down along the way, for Radha and Govinda to eventually reach the Amber Fort, where Jai Singh II was ruling. Years to go 265 kilometers. Just see what responsibility devotees have taken on our behalf, on Krishna's behalf, but on our behalf as well, what sacrifices they've made through the years, what difficult times they've gone through. And again, as I said in another lecture, it's all been handed to us on a golden plate. We cannot become familiar with all these gifts we've received. We can't procrastinate and, I'll become Krishna conscious later in life when I'm an old man. Old means just before you die. So you could be old at 25. So all these precious things we have in Krishna consciousness, just see what so many Vaishnavas and Vaishnavis did, rulers did. What would life be without Radha Govinda? You go to that temple, every time it's like a milestone in your life to go to Jaipur and see. It's just started again, the worship now. They've reopened the temple after the purge or surge of coronavirus. They've opened it up, but I've heard there's thousands. People now are going with even more eagerness and more devotion to see Radha Govinda Dev. I'm going to wait a little while. So it's described so touching that when the bullock cart was secretly going very slowly down through all these couple hundred of kilometers, was going, when it was moving, Vaishnav people would discreetly line the roads, pretending that they're doing some work, or, they're cleaning, or they're just on the side of the road, selling pan or vegetables or fruits. And as the cart would pass by, because they knew the cart was coming, the word would spread, they would mentally offer obeisances in their minds to Radha Govinda, hidden in the cart. And then they would very silently, or with a whisper, offer prayers, with tears in their eyes. And then they would throw flower petals in the tracks of the wheels, the wooden wheels, as they came by onto the ground. And as the cart moved on, they may have never seen Radha Govinda, and probably they would never see them. But still they showed so much love and devotion. This is deity worship. They couldn't even see the deity, but they knew, they'd heard about the deity, they'd fallen in love through Shravanam Kirtanam, to just hearing about Krishna. So he came by in the cart and they'd mentally offer prayers, mentally bow down, offer prayers, and as the cart came by, throw some, just so no spies could see it, like that. That was a worship of Govinda. And we can go and see him. We can do kirtan in front of him. We can pray to him. Actually, every year, like I do with in Prabhupada's Samadhi, every year when I go to Jaipur, I always take a few moments and I pray to the deity. What I do is I tell Radha Govinda what I've done that year in my service to Srila Prabhupada and the Sankirtan movement. I just tell them that I've done this and I've done that, and thank you so much for this opportunity, and please you bless me to help continue pushing forward the Sankirtan movement of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. It's always a very intense moment for me. Just take a little time when I go somewhere and sit alone and I can see the deities and I'm praying, because some of that deity is very dear to me as well. I think because it's one of the, when I was a new devotee, I was coming to India in 74, 73, 74, and when we went to Jaipur and we came into the temple for the greeting of the deities, so many thousands of people chanting from their hearts. That was an overwhelming experience for me. I cannot forget that. So I have a real taste of bhakti there. So perhaps that's why. And I'm sure many of you as well. I know Bibi Govinda Maharaj and Kala Samvara and Chadaratma and Shitala and so many of my godbrothers and godsisters. We just look forward to going to seeing Radha Govindaji. Historical deities and very merciful deities. So in this way they passed hidden under straw and hay and then came the final days of the journey. The final days of the journey. It's written that they were about 50 kilometers from Amber, from the Amber fort, and some Mughal spies found out what was happening, and they alerted some Mughal soldiers who immediately started to search for this bullock cart. And our pujaris, I'll call them our pujaris because we're all one family, our pujaris were warned, and they contacted the bullock cart driver, and he turned off the road, and he went into a little village and he hid the deities. And they stayed there for several months. Although they were only some kilometers from Amber, they stayed there for a few months. Then one day, the deities were placed back on the bullock cart, and they went out again. And they started going towards Amber. I think they got something like 9 or 10 kilometers away, and the Mughal spies got word again. So this somehow came back to the driver, and he drove off the road into the jungle, into a village that is now famous as Govindapur. I don't know what it was called before, but the deity stayed there, I think, for 2 years. They're close, but just to be sure, they stayed and they were worshipped in that town, which I think it was renamed Govindapur later on. So then one night, in total darkness, the bullock cart left with Radha Govinda for the last few kilometers of that very long journey. And some scholars say that they were discovered by the soldiers themselves only a few hundred meters from the gate at Amber Fort. And there's this chilling description of how the bullock cart driver was whipping the bullocks. You know, how fast do bullocks go? Whipping that they gallop as fast as they could, as the Mughal soldiers, eager for victory after so many years, were catching up with them with raised swords. Phew. And just as they were about to catch up with the cart, it reached Amber Fort. And the Amber Fort guards, the devotees, they threw open these huge wooden gates. And it's described the cart tumbled inside just in time. As the gates closed, and the Mughal soldiers crashed with full speed into the gate and were thrown off their horses and scattered everywhere. Sri Radha Govinda Deva ki, Jai Singh the second ki, Jai Singh the first ki, all those wonderful Vaishnavas ki, Sri Rupa Goswami ki, Sri Prabhupada ki. Wow, that's adventure. That would make good cinema someday. So soon, inside the fort, a huge crowd of people came pouring out of their homes and shops to welcome Sri Radha Govinda home again. And several days later, the deities were taken to a place called Kanak Vrindavan. We've gone there many times with our parikrama group. Later on, the kings developed it into a beautiful garden. There's a beautiful temple there, but they took them to Kanak Vrindavan, and there they began the worship in full glory. And the festival the next day, Jai Singh II came before the deity, you can imagine. And he made a very loud declaration, so all could hear. He said to Govinda, Lord, you need a residential accommodation, so I vow that I will build a beautiful temple for you. Wow. Lord, you need a residential accommodation, so I vow that I will build a beautiful temple for you. And history has shown, he took it a step further, and he built an entire city for Radha Govinda, entire city. And that city he called Jaipur, and that means the city of victory. And strategically, it's just a few kilometers from the Amber Fort. The Amber Fort's in a really good position. It's high up on a hill. You can still visit today that palace. It's a tourist attraction now, but the city of Jaipur is kind of over the mountain and through a little gully, and then it's very well protected, Jaipur, actually. So he built Jaipur for Radha Govinda. And he had the temple that he'd promised them. Promised them a temple, we gave him a city. But that temple that he built for Radha Govinda, he constructed it in the very center of the city. And he constructed it in such a way that from his residence, because he has a palace in Jaipur, so he constructed his palace so that when he would get up in the morning, he would walk out on his veranda and look directly into the temple when the curtains opened. And the first thing he could see in the morning was Sri Radha Govinda. So you go there now into the temple, and we're always facing the temple, but if you turn around and you look over the fence, there's an iron fence there, you'll see the original palace. And from the veranda, the king, the first thing he would see was Krishna. Raj Rishi. How the world would be so blessed if we had presidents, prime ministers, dictators, whatever, kings who were Krishna conscious, who knew how to materially manage society, but knew that the real importance was spiritual progress and arranged for people to, you could say, practice the religion of their choice, but to practice it. That's what we need today, Raja Rishis. So, Jai Singh II was a very good ruler in every sense of the word. It is said that due to his devotion, in part, towards Radha Govinda, the deities became the life and soul of every resident in the city. Still true to a certain degree now. And he himself arranged for gorgeous worship of the Lord by the most qualified Gaudiya Vaishnava Brahmanas. He actually personally supervised everything. And he inspired all his citizens in devotion to Radha Govinda. Even his soldiers were caught up in the enthusiasm. I was reading that, they had a battle cry as they charged into battle. Soldiers, they'll cry out when they're going onto the battlefield. They'll say something to scare the enemy or just to encourage themselves. So these Rajput soldiers, they would go into battle. As they're riding into battle, what was their battle cry? Jai Ho Govindaji, Jai Ho Govindaji, Jai Ho Govindaji. What a battle cry. And it's described also that he not only encouraged his subjects, but he also inspired other kings as well, because historically at that time there was the kings didn't get along so well. That's one reason the Muslims were able to conquer North India, because the kings of India, especially we're talking about the Rajput kings, they couldn't cooperate amongst each other, unfortunately. But he was very good at inspiring them to be good kings based on their devotion to Krishna. Because not only Jaipur were, the Mewar kings, and there's so many kings who are great devotees of Krishna, but our Jai Singh II, he was special. And I was reading, he was friends for a long time, and that of a king named Raja Jayamala, who was king of Medata. They were tight, the two of them. And this king Raja Jayamala, just to show you how he was close friends with Jai Singh II, but just see how elevated these personalities were. Raja Jayamala's, there's a wonderful pastime told about him in a book called Sri Bhaktimala. I don't know if many of you know that there is a book called Sri Bhaktimala, and it was written by Sri Rupa Goswami. And it's the history of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Vaishnavas through the ages, I will say. And this book was authorized by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Yeah, I read that in the Harmonist. He liked that book. Who wouldn't like hearing about other Vaishnavas' glories in Krishna consciousness? So Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he liked this book, and even occasionally he would comment on it. So Bhaktimala by Sri Rupa Goswami is just about the lives. It's a book just glorifying devotees. And I sometimes read it. And as I was preparing for this lecture, I happened to come across the pastime of Raja Jayamala. It's on page 183 if you get a copy. And I told this story some years ago, but a little bit different way, because it had come down through various sources. But this is the authorized source of this story. And it's just going to melt your heart. Raja Jayamala, good friend of Jai Singh II. This Raja Jayamala, he had his kingdom. And he was very much attached to serving and worshiping the Lord himself, just like Jai Singh II. And despite being a king with so many responsibilities, every day he would spend at least 4 hours in his own little temple performing services for his deities, who were called Radhasham Sundar. And he had a rule, actually it was a decree, that if during his service to the Lord anyone would approach him for whatever purpose, he would simply ignore that person. That was his time with Krishna. And he felt that the worship of Krishna was important for him and for the kingdom as well, Yagyavai Vishnu. So if anyone would come, no matter how important the business was, he'd just ignore that person. And not only that, Sri Bhaktimala says that if someone came to disturb him at the wrong time, he would have that person killed. Hare Krishna. So out of fear, no one dared disturb him when he was doing his puja to Radha Shyama. Now one of Raj Jayamala's brothers was the king of Mondovara, another kingdom. The king of Mondovara, that was his brother. But unfortunately, as sometimes was the case in those days, his brother was very inimical towards him. Very inimical. He did not like Raja Jayamala. They didn't get along at all. So once this king of Mondovara, he took his army and he surrounded Raja Jayamala's city with this vast army at the exact time that Jayamala was doing the puja. He knew about this. So this was his tactful diplomacy. He attacked the city of his brother when his brother was doing puja, because he knew that for no reason would he leave. Of course, he probably thought, well, maybe he'll come out, but he'll be delayed. So although the situation was very critical, the whole kingdom was surrounded by this army of the king of Mondovara. But no one had the courage to approach King Jayamala to give him the news. But finally, Raj Jayamala's mother went to his little temple. And she just broke in. And she's the mom. She's the queen mother, you could say. And she told him about this invasion. There's thousands and thousands of enemy soldiers, your brother, surrounded, and they're ready to attack. And, we haven't got it together. But after hearing everything, Raj Jayamala, according to Bhaktimala, he simply said, God will surely do what is best. Please leave, mother. Wow. He had so much faith in Krishna. God will surely do what is best. And then he continued on with his puja. Ding, ding, ding. There's an army about to invade. He's doing puja. But this is an amazing story in Bhaktimala. It's authorized. So then the Lord, who's always the protector and savior of his devotee, did something amazing in the annals of Vaishnava history. What did he do, the Lord? The Lord himself manifested the form of a soldier. And going into Jayamala's stables, where he had all these special horses, the Lord manifested as a soldier with the dress and the physique and the ambience, etc. And he took Raj Jayamala's own horse from the stables. And the Lord, according to Bhaktimala, the Lord rode out onto the battlefield and single-handedly killed, injured, or drove away all the enemy soldiers. Then the Lord rode back into the stable and he left Jayamala's horse there and he disappeared. Now all the citizens who were actually up on the ramparts watching this, they were overjoyed. But everyone was wondering, they knew the horse, but they couldn't figure out who was the rider. They're all praising this mysterious warrior. Praise the mysterious warrior. Now Jayamala, Raj Jayamala, it's described in Bhaktimala, he was unaware of what was happening. And after finally completing his daily worship, he rushed, he's the king, so okay, now it's time to be a king. He rushed to his stable to get his horse, to join the battle, which he assumed was still raging. But when he got to the stables, he saw that his horse was breathing very heavily and appeared to be very tired. So he asked the stablemen, those in charge of taking care of the horse, who rode this horse? So they just said, the mystery rider. The mystery rider. So, anyway, still thinking the battle was going on, Raj Jaimal, he's a wonderful devotee, but his seva, like Arjuna, is to fight for Dharma, for Krishna. So he mounted his horse and he got his swords ready and he rode swiftly out to the battlefield. But when he got there, all the enemy soldiers were, either dead or lying on the ground or running away in the distance. Many were just injured. And his brother, the King of Mondovara, he was lying severely injured on the ground. And as he was, going through this battlefield and seeing, trying to take in what had happened, when Raja Jaimala, it's described that Bhaktimala describes him from this point on, it describes him as Sri Jaimala. Sri Jaimala. When he approached his brother, who was lying on the battlefield, his brother could still speak. And Bhaktimala records his exact words, what the brother said, the brother who had attacked, Sri Jaimala. He looked up and he said to his brother, "Who was that warrior who took charge of your army? He alone drove away all my soldiers. Although he injured me, after seeing his beautiful form, my mind has become so attracted to him." Hare Krishna. Who was that warrior who took charge of your army? He alone drove away all my soldiers. Although he injured me, apparently the Lord injured him, after seeing his beautiful form, my mind has become attracted to him. So when Sri Jaimala heard this, he immediately understood what had happened. How the Lord, his Lord, Shyamasundar, had taken the form of a soldier. He come to the battlefield and he protected the kingdom. So Sri Jaimala, he was very delighted. So he said to his brother, quote, "My brother, you are fortunate, for you have seen him with your own eyes. But I am unfortunate because my eyes are simply anxious to still see him. Up to this day, I have not attained his darshan. My brother, you are fortunate, for you have seen him with your own eyes. But I am unfortunate because my eyes are simply anxious. I'm waiting to see him. Up to this day, I have not attained his darshan." Meaning the Krishna present there, moving, speaking. So then Sri Jaimala explained to his brother that it was his worshipable Lord Shyamasundar who had displayed mercy to him. He said, "It's my Lord. My Lord assumed that form, my Shyamasundar." And then Sri Jaimala forgave his brother and allowed him to return to his kingdom. But before departing, his brother, the King of Mondovara, he promised that he himself would begin to render service to the Supreme Lord every day. Like this. What a wonderful pastime. Bhaktimala. Try to get a copy. There's, 1,000 Vaishnavas in there. I think it's going to be printed very soon by some printing house in Vrindavan. Hare Krishna. So today we've given a full spectrum as best as we could of our beloved Radha Govinda's history. But we could say that they've had their pastimes in more recent history as well. In their pratibhu. Pratibhu means the deities' expanded forms. Like if you go to Kambivan now, there's also deities of Radha Govinda because they were there for so long, they were worshipped. So the Pratibhu means that they install, when Radha Govinda left to go to Amber and Jaipur, they installed Radha Govinda deities at Kambivan. So they're considered non-different than the original. It's called Pratibhu. So in more recent history, we see that Radha Govinda's Pratibhu expanded forms have also been very active. And how so? Because Srila Prabhupada named one of his favorite sets of Radha Krishna deities in New York, Sri Radha Govinda. And we know how, you could almost say dear New York was to Srila Prabhupada, because it was his base, it was the place he started the Sankirtan movement of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in Western countries. So he considered it a very important city. He could have gone anywhere else, but he went to New York. And there, the deities that he installed, they became famous as Sri Radha Govinda. Yeah. So Radha Govinda, we can say, are very dear to Srila Prabhupada. And for another reason as well. And that was that Radha Govinda were dear to Prabhupada because they were dear to Rupa Goswami. And Rupa Goswami was very dear to Srila Prabhupada. It's all connected. Actually, one time, Guru Das, one of Srila Prabhupada's early disciples, he narrated a story that Prabhupada had personally told him. Prabhupada told him that when he was in Vrindavan before coming to the West, he would often sit in front of Rupa Goswami's samadhi and he would pray. Prabhupada said this is how he would pray. O Rupa Goswami, please show yourself to me and give me guidance and strength to realize my mission. We often hear how Prabhupada would be taking prasadam in his little kitchen area there, and he would take prasadam while glancing at the sacred samadhi of Sri Rupa Goswami. So he took so much inspiration from him. And Prabhupada actually said, when he was recounting this all to Guru Das, he said that Rupa Goswami actually appeared to me, Prabhupada said, and he told me, quote, now you have written some books. Take them to the Western countries and preach. Do not delay. Do not hesitate any longer. Now this was the same instruction that his Guru Maharaj, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, had given him decades earlier. So Prabhupada said, feeling the strength that, that he'd received, the mercy he'd received from Rupa Goswami's blessings, Prabhupada, not long after that, he made that determined effort to go to the West. Wow. So I feel the most appropriate way to finish today's class are two verses in glorification of Sri Rupa Goswami, by whose mercy we have Radha Govindaji. By whose mercy we have Radha Govinda, standing, you could say, most gloriously today in Jaipur, or the city of victory, and who we can visit from time to time to also pray for their mercy. So we're very much indebted to Sri Rupa Goswami. When you think of Radha Govinda, you think of Rupa Goswami. When you think of Rupa Goswami, you think of Radha Govinda. So let's finish with two prayers glorifying Sri Rupa Goswami. Sri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Shtapitam Jena Bhutale Shwayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadanti Sva Padantikam. When will Sri Rupa Goswami Prabhupada, who has established within this material world the mission to fulfill the desire of Lord Chaitanya, give me shelter under his lotus feet? And a verse composed by Raghunath Das Goswami, Sri Rupa Goswami's close associate. Adadhanas trinam dhantair idam yache puna puna Shrimad Rupa Padam Boja Rajoham Sham Bhave Bhave. Quote, taking a blade of grass between my teeth and falling on the ground like a stick, I beg again and again that I may obtain the dust of Sri Rupa Goswami's lotus feet, birth after birth. Hare Krishna Prabhu's. All glories to Rupa Goswami's beloved Shri Radha Govinda Dev. All glories to Srila Prabhupada's beloved Radha Govinda Dev in New York, and all the other Radha Govindas around the world. All glories to the Sankirtan movement of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, which is inundating the world with Krishna Prema. All glories to Srila Prabhupada, Mahaprabhu's great general in service to the Sankirtan movement. And all glories to all of you devotees who are so nicely serving Srila Prabhupada in this wonderful ISKCON movement. Anyway, thank you. I was really looking forward to giving this class, and I feel like I could give it 100 times again. But next class we'll speak about Gopinath. Gopinath. We've had lots of nectar with Madan Mohan, and now with Govindaji. So next in line is Radha Gopinath. And there's some wonderful, wonderful leelas about them as well, the deities of Madhu Pandit. So we'll see you in a few days, and we'll discuss those wonderful pastimes. So thank you. Shri Shri Gauranitai ki, Shri Shri Krishna Balaram ki, Shri Shri Radha Shama Sundar ki, Vrindavaneshwari Shrimati Radharani ki, Shri Shri Radha Govinda Deva ki, Shri Shri Jai Singh the first key, Shri Shri Jai Singh the second key, Raja Jai Mala ki, Gol Premanandi, Loka Vrindavan Dhamma ki, Jai Jai Sri Radhe, Sham, Haribol.